Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners, this is the first episode of Turan Tales and I could not be more excited. In this episode, I will tell you what Turan Tales is, where the idea came from, and then invite you to listen to an interview with today's guest, a journalist, Peter Leonard, with whom I spoke about what it's like to work in the region these days and what kind of journalism Central Asia needs. You've just listened to a fragment of one of my favorite songs, Babakai by Amalia, my friend from Tashkent. I really encourage you to check her out on Spotify. She's a great talent from Uzbekistan and I'm really grateful that she's allowed me to use her song in this podcast. Now, a few words about me and what brought me to Central Asia in the first place. I studied international relations in the United Kingdom and international relations in Eurasia in Russia, where I focused on the post-Soviet space. This included Central Asia and I really wanted to see the region with my own eyes. So in 2015, I spent several months traveling across the region and that is when I started writing articles about the area. I wanted to stay, but at the time I didn't really know how to do it, I didn't know whether it would be doable and I had a different life plan. This changed in 2018. At the time I was working as a journalist in Lebanon and was planning to stay, learn Arabic and dedicate my career to reporting from the Middle East. Until I accidentally learned that 2 years after coming to power of President Shavkat Mirziyoyev, Uzbekistan was organizing a techno-rave at the desert in Moynak, a former port town at the shores of the Aral Sea. It sounded like a crazy idea, and I wanted to check it out. The Aral Sea began to shrink in the 1960s, and when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Moynak was a gloomy, deserted town. Its residents were leaving in huge numbers for Kazakhstan or Tashkent in search of work, and few had hopes for the development of the region. But in 2019, a lawyer who loved techno decided to organize the first outdoor rave in Uzbekistan right at the former shores of the Aral Sea. He called it Stichia, which in Russian means the element, and before he knew it, he started a movement having a tremendous impact on Uzbekistan's youth culture, nightlife, and music. I found out about Stichia from Twitter. I felt it was a sign. I asked my editors if they would be interested in stories from Uzbekistan, and they commissioned a few pieces. I got a visa, packed my bags, and off I went to the strangest festival the world has seen. This was the beginning of my 3-year-long stay in Uzbekistan, when I had a chance to witness its juggling between the promise of freedom and hardcore authoritarianism. I was the only Western journalist permanently based in the country and led a fun, happy life in Tashkent. But that was about to change. 1.5 years into my arrival, pressure began. A man who worked for both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and, as it turned out, the security services, tried to force me to write positive stories about Uzbekistan. His attempts included unwanted sexual advances. Once his strategy failed, I fell victim to a well-crafted hate campaign on social media. I was accused of being an LGBT activist, which apparently contradicted Uzbek mentality, insulting the whole nation and, believe it or not, being an American spy. A particularly annoying accusation given the years I spent writing stories critical of US foreign policy. In the end, in November 2021, I was not allowed to enter the country. I spent 2 nights sleeping rough at the border between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan before I was transported to the airport to take a plane home. I would lie if I said that the event did not take its toll on my mental well-being. In fact, it took me 3 years to return to reporting on and from Central Asia. But here I am. If you're interested to know more about Shavkat Mirziyoyev's new Uzbekistan and my own story, learn Polish and read my book, which was published by the Czarno Publishing House in 2023. Otherwise, stay tuned. I'm sure that I will be occasionally bringing up anecdotes from my time in the region. But today I would like to talk about journalism in Central Asia and Turan Tales. The region is getting increasingly strict when it comes to freedom of speech. While Turkmenistan and Tajikistan have long been closed to any independent media, and Uzbekistan enjoyed only a short period of regulated freedom, for years Kazakhstan and especially Kyrgyzstan were relatively free. This is now changing, and the reasons are multiple. One of them may be related to the West's lack of interest in what is going on in the region. Western media has not cared much about Central Asia. And we all know that if human rights violations and systemic corruption bring no outrage, countries will be continuing to act the way they always have. That's why we need journalism. And yet, almost none of the big wires and magazines have correspondents in the region. Those foreign journalists who come once a year, if they do, usually do stories that nobody who knows the region finds relevant. That's why last year I decided to return to Central Asia and then came up with an idea to create a platform with stories that I would like to read and listen to myself. I want Turan Tales to be a platform dedicated to the region, which does not treat it as Russia's or China's backyard. Each episode of this podcast will be divided into 2 parts. In the first part, I will bring you a story of a person, a phenomenon, or an idea, and in the second part, a guest will join me for an in-depth Turan talk about the issue. If this sounds good to you, follow Turan Tales on Instagram, Facebook, and most importantly, subscribe to my Substack newsletter. It will bring my long reads and episodes of this podcast directly to your inbox. And do get in touch with me to tell me what you think about Turan Tales. I'm new to podcasting and newsletters, and I definitely need guidance. On Substack, you can support the project with a small donation of €8 a month, a yearly donation, or a founder donation, all of which will give you additional perks. If you like this podcast, I will be immensely grateful if you could support my work. Turan Tales is an independent project created out of sheer passion and love for the region, but I will only be able to continue it beyond the first season if I can afford it. If you can't afford a paid subscription but are listening, thank you. I will do my best to keep the content free of charge for as long as Turan Tales exists. For now, you can expect 2 long reads and 2 podcast episodes a month. If you have any ideas on what stories I should cover or how to mobilize a community around the podcast, feel free to message me. And now, following this little introduction, let's move to the second part of the episode. Welcome to Turan Talks. Today I'm joined by Peter Leonard, former Associated Press correspondent, later the editor of EurasiaNet, and now the founder of Havli newsletter on Substack, and also a co-host of the Caps Unlock podcast. Is that all?
Yes. Hi, Agnieszka. That's a very good and full, I think, description. I won't bore you with the finer details, but yes, I'm very honored to be your first guest on Turan Tales. I hope this is going to be a highlight of my career so far.
Well, I hope so too. Anyway, thank you for joining me, and I'm really glad that you are my first guest. I invited you to talk and reflect on the work in Central Asia, the environment we work on, and the ways how we might be able to improve it. Has the situation ever been as bad as it is now in the region for journalists?
Well, look, yes, it has been as bad as this. I think it's been probably considerably worse, if we're perfectly honest. But as far as the state of journalism in Central Asia today, look, we mustn't have exceedingly short memories. I mean, if we think about Uzbekistan, a country which you obviously know very well, only 10 years ago, the country was ruled by a very different kind of president. Say what you like about the incumbent president, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, but the previous president was of an authoritarian leader of an entirely different style. And being a journalist, being a foreign journalist at that time was in fact almost impossible. As you mentioned rightly in describing my kind of previous jobs, I was the Associated Press correspondent, among other places in Central Asia at that time, and I was never able to go to the country as a journalist. I was never given accreditation. These days, you can get accreditation. The kind of journalism you can do, of course, is limited. You have your own experiences, obviously, having been expelled from the country. So I can understand that you may not welcome my perhaps slightly rose-tinted view of things. But I would say that although it's challenging, I don't think we should be too bleak and grim about everything.
That's actually really nice to hear you say that, because I'm getting a little bit pessimistic, to be honest, because Kyrgyzstan is getting quite difficult to work in, especially for local journalists, but I guess with time it will affect us too. Then Kazakhstan too. Tajikistan is out of question, really. We can't really work properly in Tajikistan anymore. Turkmenistan as well. And Uzbekistan, I'm not sure. That's why I asked you in the beginning, but maybe let's go back in time a little bit. And if you think of Central Asia, what exactly comes to your mind? What kind of pictures or what kind of memories?
The first time I went to Central Asia was in the early 2000s. So it was just after, and I hate using this as a marker, but fortunately it is. It was just after 9/11. And at that time, Central Asia suddenly became the focus of interest for the West more broadly. Nobody had ever heard of Central Asia, really. These countries kind of were unpronounceable and nobody knew how to spell them, and nobody certainly knew where they were. And my fascination with that part of the world was specifically because that very thing. I mean, I was as ignorant as anybody else really about what was going on there. I mean, my background is as a Russianist, so I lived in Russia in the 90s as a student and then gone to work in Russia. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting place down there. I just purely as a tourist went to visit it in the early 2000s. And what I found was this region. I mean, Uzbekistan was the first country I visited in Central Asia. I think my residing memory is really of a country still in sort of numb survival mode. I mean, even when I think about it now, I mean, it was really just over a decade after the Soviet Union had collapsed. For people in the region, there's no underestimating what a cataclysmic shock to the system that was. I'm not trying to paint a gloss over the Soviet experience, but to suddenly find yourself thrust into this new reality was, I think, extremely traumatic. And then with all of the kind of economic pain that came with it. And on top of that, in Uzbekistan in particular, all of the authoritarian mechanism that the state put in place in order to avoid the country teetering off the precipice. So I think my memory of the region when I first went was of a slightly sort of shell-shocked country, a little bit frozen in time, quite Soviet, not quite Soviet, independent, but not really independent. And so if I was going to kind of pathologize the region and problems it continues to have today, I think it would be to say that there's a lot of stuff wrapped up in the original sin. I think there's a lot of authoritarian habits that I think can be drawn back to that traumatic period. And it's not to make excuses, but I think out of a sense of fairness, I would sort of try to at least acknowledge the extreme difficulty that these countries experienced at that time.
I started covering Central Asia a little bit later than you, 2015. And I remember what struck me really was how Uzbekistan, in my case, rapidly changed from a country that was completely closed and really with limited internet into a country where every second person on the street was a blogger. I mean, obviously, I'm exaggerating now, but it really was a very rapid change. So when you look at your experience in Central Asia, what are the main changes that you can see over the past, almost 1.5 decades, right? Or almost 2 decades?
Yeah, I'm afraid it's 2 decades, even more than that. Oh, God, I feel so old. I think that there are subtle things. I think like this gradual transition from being a post-Soviet country to being something other than a post-Soviet country. I know people who are politically minded really bristle at that post-Soviet label, and I know, God knows, I used it myself writing for a general audience like the Associated Press. The post-Soviet label, unfortunately, was one that was just editorially mandated because people just didn't have a sense of what these countries were. And I think in many ways, countries themselves didn't necessarily have a sense of what they were. And so I think if one major change I would speak about is this assertion of identity. I mean, all of the governments in their own ways try to create a sense of identity pretty much from day one. That's almost not exaggerating. I think that process, I think, really has only begun to bear fruit in the relatively recent past, whether it's in terms of a sense of self or linguistically, or just because, with the passage of time, I think sort of identity begins to emerge. Other than that, again, I don't like to be the kind of Pollyanna in this situation, but of course, people continue to endure considerable hardship now as they did before. But I think the hardship is definitely of a considerably diminished order in most of the region. I think of Kazakhstan, many parts of Kazakhstan are decidedly prosperous. I think Uzbekistan also is not by any means universally an economically happy place, but the government, I think, can with some justification point to its successes in lifting people out of the most desperate poverty. And poverty looks different as well. I do remember again from my and this was relatively, I guess, late in the Soviet transition in the early 2000s. There was a real kind of, sometimes a sense of despair. I mean, the kind of despair that people would talk about in the 1990s was still lingering in the air in the early 2000s. And I think you don't quite see that anymore. And I think Uzbekistan, for all of its shortcomings, which I'm sure we can speak about at great length, the prevailing mood I find today is nevertheless one of optimism and hope. I think there is a sort of a sense that many people have, not everybody, probably not most people, but it's much more common than it used to be. The sense that, gosh, I can kind of make my way. I can make a success of my life. And that was something that you didn't really tend to encounter a great deal 2 decades ago.
Yeah, and I also think that this kind of free market thinking is something that Shavkat Mirziyoyev's administration is actually pushing, is trying to encourage this kind of thinking in the youth. So yeah, definitely that's something that I can see too. I would like to move to a topic that is maybe not the most pleasant, and it's about how the view of Central Asia is being shaped by mainstream media. Because very often when I read news about the region, I somehow don't recognize this region. I somehow don't recognize those countries. Of course, this is not the case with every single big media outlet, but I would say that there is something of a lack of understanding and lack of appreciation for the region in mainstream media. What do you think about it? And what is the biggest sin of mainstream media?
Yeah, I also find it very frustrating. I've sort of devoted a lot of my life to covering this region. So banalities and alike, we can rattle them off, whether it's a great game or Russia's backyard, great power rivalry narratives, all that stuff. I mean, I don't know if it's wrong per se, but it's just so banal. And now with AI, you can just get AI to write these articles. Really, they'll be better than whatever any human being would come up with. So, and they were never that good to begin with. So that stuff is the thing that annoys me. I mean, I can't get myself to be too cross when somebody well-meaning tries to write an article that comes off badly or in which there are mistakes. I don't know why, but the example that comes to mind was this a pretty actually idiotic phrase that somebody once used, which was they called Central Asia. Do you remember this when they called Central Asia the moustache belt? And everybody on Twitter was really confused because not that many people in Central Asia tend to have moustaches. But Central Asian Twitter collectively had a big kind of strop about this for, 2 or 3 days. And I thought, actually, if that was the worst thing that people did, kind of gave silly names like that to Central Asia, I think would be lucky. The problem we have is that we've sort of fallen between two stools in terms of kind of the way that the world looks at Central Asia, because Central Asia, for good or for bad, was not, the colonial possession of any country in Western Europe or the English-speaking world or anywhere like that. So as a result, there isn't a pre-baked-in audience for things that are going on in the region, as there would be for instance, parts of South Asia or Africa or South America or what have you. And so in people's minds, it's sort of an impossibly peripheral place somewhere over there. I really do think if you walk down a street anywhere in the United States or the UK, that ask people, just very vaguely point on a map where even Kazakhstan was. Kazakhstan, maybe the best known country in Central Asia. I would be surprised if what percent? I don't know. I would be interested in hearing your guess, but I'm guessing it would be less than 10% would actually point to the right place on the map. So, that's a challenge. I can't bring myself to be too harsh in my judgment of the mainstream media or the Western press. I just understand that we have a kind of a structural, historical problem that we're going up against. Nevertheless, I think if you are a conscientious foreign editor, it's your duty to avoid banality and silliness and cliche. And I feel like we've done great game already. God, I mean, how many decades have we been doing this great game thing? It wasn't even accurate when you first started using it, and it's even less accurate now. I think your readers deserve better.
Yeah, I also think that the problem is that editors are not really interested in devoting their time to the region. I think this is a general problem that usually people, both journalists and editors who cover Central Asia, their main beat is Russia. Right? Or sometimes maybe some other country in the region like China. But in general, there is very little interest in finding people who would devote their careers to studying the region. So I think that this is another problem that we have. Central Asia is probably one of the most underreported regions in the world. I sometimes envy my colleagues who cover the Middle East, which I also do sometimes, or even Central and Eastern Europe. These regions are much better covered. They are much more appreciated, and it's much easier to find interest in stories from there. So what is it about Central Asia that seems so mysterious, also incomprehensible, that it's so difficult to sell?
It's, I think, a victim of a number of things. I think the part of it may be a sort of, I don't like this term, but I'm going to use it anyway, a kind of an Orientalist mindset. And I illustrate this by talking about, again, a very non-journalistic thing. I just remember hanging out in a hotel and lobby in Kyrgyzstan, in Bishkek, and I was eavesdropping on this group of French tourists, and they were complaining among themselves that they'd been to the local bazaar, the Osh Bazaar in Bishkek. And they were saying to each other, "Oh my God, it was just the bazaar was so rubbish. It was just Chinese stuff and just things people to use in their house." Like, they were complaining about the fact that this bazaar actually sold the things that Kyrgyz people would actually want from a bazaar, because that's what like most bazaars sell, right? But they had been on a big tour across the Silk Road. Like, this is a kind of a rite of passage for French tourists of a certain age is to go travel across the Silk Road region, quote unquote. And I think that kind of their impression of what a bazaar in Central Asia should look like is kind of wafting silk and spices and people with pointy shoes and fez hats or whatever. And so my point is that I think that people have this sort of expectation of what that, this region that we cover is supposed to be like. And when they kind of confront the reality of it, which is that Central Asia is a very odd place, really. It's exotic, right? Like, it's Oriental, and yet it sort of isn't. I mean, there's a sort of a European sheen over it because of the Russian and then the Soviet legacy. It's always been my suspicion that there's a certain disappointment in the region, that it feels modern in the right way and unmodern in other ways that are a bit too hard to explain. I don't know what you think of that, but that's kind of my half-formed theory.
No, I agree with you completely. And I think that it was like that even more a couple of years ago. Now, I think especially Uzbekistan is going towards this kind of Vostochna Сказка, Eastern fairy tale or tale architecture and style. But yeah, a couple of years ago, it wasn't like that at all. And I remember when I first moved to Tashkent, I found this really strange familiarity of the place, because I grew up in Poland. I grew up in Krakow. Maybe Krakow is not the most Soviet city that you can find, but still I do remember blocks of flats and this kind of architecture of the 70s. And I found a very similar landscape in Uzbekistan, which was very familiar, much more familiar than other countries that I lived in. For example, London. So yeah, I think that you can find loads of different interesting things in Central Asia, not necessarily the Oriental fairy tale type of place.
But you know what I'm saying? Like, that is sort of cognitive dissonance for people. I think that that hurdle is quite hard for the general reader sometimes to get over. And there's just a lot of funny leaders with long names, and I don't know. It just does feel very remote. I have tended to write most about politics, and I guess perhaps I'm realizing in this conversation, though, not that this is not a new epiphany, but I think that we need to talk about people, much more, instead of countries, nations and states and politics. And I think that may be where the answer lies.
Yes, and another problem that I have with Western coverage of Central Asia is the way we portray dictatorships. It's very funny. We seem to view the Central Asian dictators as some funny guys who do funny things, who come up with crazy ideas. But the thing is that it's not funny. And I think that maybe not we, maybe not you and me, but people who cover the region from time to time, they very often forget that it's not funny to live in a dictatorship and that we should really focus on the people and how they cope with life under such circumstances. I don't know what you think about that, but I'm quite annoyed when I see this kind of orientalistic journalism, which looks at the heads of states as some sort of sultans who just have their funny ways.
I mean, look, I do agree with that, but I'm not above, pointing to certain quirks and eccentricities and absurdities when it feels appropriate. And I think that, there's obviously one country. This is kind of the elephant in the room when we talk about this topic. And I know I've been reprimanded in the past by Turkmens in sometimes dwelling too much on the peculiarities of the various presidents who have led Turkmenistan. But I think honestly, I think I do, at least in that particular instance, I bristle a little bit at the suggestion that you're supposed to very high-mindedly pretend that stuff is not happening, because it's the bonkers nature of the dictatorial regime in Turkmenistan is kind of part and parcel of the whole thing. So, to not speak about it, I think would be, to do a disservice to the person who's really trying to understand the utter kind of arbitrariness and the kind of the eccentricity is kind of absolutely part of the DNA. Other countries in the region, it's the humor, I have to admit, does not kind of jump out at me quite as immediately as it does in some cases. Although, to belabor the point, I mean, in Kyrgyzstan, for instance, yes, Kyrgyzstan is going through a moment, let's put it that way. It's definitely going to a model of authoritarianism, which I think is new for Kyrgyzstan. But again, it's a very strange, folksy, and dare I say it, maybe again, I'm kind of speaking to your point, at sometimes a little quite absurd and comical authoritarianism. When you have a health minister who's telling people to drink poison to cure themselves of COVID, and head of the security services who's giving press conferences every other day, telling people that they shouldn't do this and they shouldn't do that, and they should be kind to their parents, and they shouldn't do MMA, wrestling, or whatever. I mean, it all has a kind of a strong kind of flavor of unseriousness. And I think that there may be a compromise there in talking about the serious things, but also saying, well, look, the reason these countries are maybe not doing as well as they could be is their own leaders don't seem to be prepared to behave seriously. To make one final point, for instance, sometimes the humor is not even humor per se, but maybe a grim black humor. I think of, in particular, of how periodically the president of Tajikistan tells the nation that they should store 2 years of food in advance in case there's any kind of major calamities. Most Tajiks have trouble stocking up food from 1 week to the next, let alone 2 years. There's nothing funny about that, but there is something absurd about it. And I think at times the absurdity is the key to really explaining at least some aspect of these countries. It's a limited way of doing it, but I get it gets you some way toward explaining why these countries seem as trapped as they are sometimes.
We recently had a really nice example of that, because I think it was the Minister of Culture of Uzbekistan said that time will come when we will force you to be free. And yeah, it came as a shock to everyone, but at the same time, just everyone started making fun of that, which I mean, I understand, because this is completely absurd and there is no other reaction than laugh. But at the same time, I have a feeling that because of the amount of absurdities in Central Asia, Western governments, Western politicians don't treat those countries seriously, or as seriously bad, for example. I remember that not long ago, the European Union decided to support Tajikistan with loads of money for different projects related to fighting terrorism and so on, not to mention development, even though these kind of human rights abuses that the Tajik leaders are committing are actually hard to find in other regions. So I also think that this kind of aura of unseriousness doesn't really help much, especially the people in the regions. I'm not sure what you think about that.
Yes, I mean, I agree. I could not agree more. And in fact, there's one thing that really puts my back up is one of the more boring things we have to do in covering Central Asia is writing about elections because they're all so choreographed. And among the many annoying things that I've had to do over my career is go and cover the press conference of the OSCE election monitoring mission. Now, I remember one time, and I got really, really quite angry because at the press conference, you have all these kind of European professional vote observers or politicians sometimes, because the delegation includes also many active politicians, getting up and they speak at the press conference. I remember one representative from, I don't remember which Baltic country, and she said something, and this was in Kyrgyzstan, and it was a particularly dirty election at the time. And so she said, well, look, the election was not ideal, but, technically it was done quite well. But of course, she said, but this is a very young country, she said. And, so it'll take time until maybe the country matures into a full democracy. And I had to kind of restrain my anger at the time because I thought, well, sorry, but, actually both got independence at exactly the same period in time. If you think that that's kind of being a pedantic, like which of these parts of the world have kind of older, more ancient cultures. What kind of, it's racism essentially is what it is, because what she's really saying is, well, we Baltic nations are part of European kind of civilization and we therefore understand what democracy is, but those people over there don't. That's essentially what it boils down to. And unfortunately, this is a mindset which, your own Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, I think in his previous incarnation as, I think, president of the European Council, he visited Tajikistan, I want to say, I don't know, about 3 years ago, I think it was, and he was greeted kind of with a red carpet and taken on a tour of the country, and they took him out on a speedboat out on Lake Sares, out to the east of the country, and he looked absolutely, like all the pictures of him kind of grinning from ear to ear. He just looked absolutely delighted. He had nothing bad to say about Tajikistan, ranking countries, I don't know, maybe the second most authoritarian country in Central Asia at the moment. And I just thought to myself, well, this is unpleasant. This is a kind of a form of contempt, really, like a European politician who now presumably considers himself a kind of a standard bearer for the revival of democratic values in Poland, but he didn't seem to afford Tajikistan the same kind of respect. And this is a rant, but we're on the same page with this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember there's actually an interesting anecdote because when I was kicked out of Uzbekistan and I was still at the border because neither Uzbekistan nor Kazakhstan wanted to let me in, a Polish right-wing politician called Ryszard Czarnecki was receiving a honoris causa at one of the local Tashkent universities. For me, it was really funny because he basically didn't say anything about me. He didn't say anything about human rights or problems with freedom of speech because he basically doesn't care and he doesn't have to because it's such a remote region. It's such a region that nobody knows and understands that he can allow himself to ignore these kind of issues. But also in this topic, I think that by saying that, yes, Central Asia is still developing and there is this dark shadow of Russia, which encouraged corruption and lack of respect for human rights during the Soviet rule, which is obviously all true. But by using those arguments, we are kind of removing agency from all those countries that have been independent for 30 years and who have educated societies. I wouldn't say that Central Asia is particularly uneducated or that people are not ready for democracy. On the contrary, the levels of literacy are very high compared to other developing regions. So I I'm actually really angry every single time I hear those arguments about Russia or China or anyone else not allowing Central Asia to develop properly.
It's what you would call the racism of low expectations. And I think that it's only proper to hold, I think, Western partners to account on this point. I think that by setting the bar so low for Central Asia in terms of how it how governments should behave, that they've essentially encouraged governments to behave in a way that is not in keeping with the values that the West alleges to uphold. But that notwithstanding, I'm just struck there's something in the news at the moment, for instance, in Uzbekistan. I'm not across the story, but I think that so somebody's been arrested in Uzbekistan, I think because they're complaining, they kind of made a public appeal against the rising utility prices. And there's been this big social media flash mob in Uzbekistan. I think the flash mob basically consists of people holding up their shoes. I think the guy who was arrested, he held up his own shoe, and you could see how worn away it was. Essentially, he was saying, look what I've been reduced to. I can't even afford to buy a new pair of shoes. And I'm very struck by the popularity of this online flash mob. And these, from time to time, we see these kind of manifestations of public solidarity in Uzbekistan. As you said, I don't think it was actually an exaggeration to say that every other person is a blogger, because for anybody who doesn't know, bloggers in Uzbekistan are, and anyone who has a Facebook account essentially can call themselves a blogger. I mean, as long as they're prepared to talk about something other than they had for lunch, then essentially you are a person with a public voice.
This leads me to my next question. So what is that the Central Asian governments don't understand about our work or about journalism in general? I remember I had loads of meetings with officials in Central Asia, and almost every time they wanted to control my reporting. They wanted to check my reporting beforehand. Some of them even thought that by giving me gifts or by being nice to me or even by hitting on me, they can encourage me to write positive stories. Is that your experience too? And what is that they don't understand about our work?
Oh my God, I could talk for so long about this. I think, again, I'll illustrate it just with one anecdote. One time I was picking up my journalistic accreditation in Kyrgyzstan. And these days, once they approve it, they just give it to you, and that's that. And there's no questions asked. But I remember on that occasion, as used to be the case in all countries to various degrees, you would have to go in for a little chat, and they would talk about your work. And I remember in Kyrgyzstan, a guy from the foreign ministry sat me down, and he very honestly and earnestly said, "Now, Peter, you are going to be objective, aren't you?" And I was like, yeah, of course I'm going to be objective. And I was okay, good. And he gave me the accreditation card, and I was so sort of struck by the strangeness of this question, because of course I can't actually be objective because I don't actually even know what that means. I mean, there's surely every reporter reports a little bit subjectively. Even the way that the concept of objectivity is so fetishistically used by governments in the region really attests to some kind of, epistemological breakdown that they seem to operate under. I don't think that they understand what journalism is. I think that many governments, many officials think that journalism is kind of like a stenographic service, or that's what it should be. So a journalist goes to a press conference, they write down word for word what the official said, and then that's what they print. And in fact, a lot of journalists, a lot of outlets in the region do still operate in that way. A lot of outlets in Russia still operate in that way. And I think that they're a little bit sort of shocked when you stray from that particular line. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the big kind of headline observation I would make. There are more kind of nuanced considerations about, when you start talking about corruption and things like that, then there you're threatening the interests of a particular figure, especially the more you go to the periphery, the regions. Local officials tend to get especially paranoid about the sense that any journalist is there to expose how they're doing a bad job. Officials often feel themselves in a kind of with journalists who are trying to do their actual job, trying to report objectively or subjectively, however you want to describe it. They deem themselves to be in a kind of an antagonistic relationship. They deem that journalist to be somebody who's trying to get one over on them or damage them. Again, I mean, I don't want to go on too long because I'm serious. I could talk about this for hours. There is a structural issue here, of course, is that many times, many journalists are in Central Asia, unfortunately, because the media market is so broken that it is the case that historically that many journalists have been, they write on order, or they'll do hit pieces about officials or business people. And so there's a kind of a an attitude towards journalists of suspicion. Sometimes it's not without basis. I think it's fair to say that. It's also fair to say, again, coming back to the whole kind of blogger and in Uzbekistan thing, many bloggers, many citizen journalists don't really know the rules about what constitutes sort of fair reporting, or they don't understand what a quote is, or they don't understand how to source information, or they don't know how to sort of package it in a way that helps the reader get a proper understanding of the real situation and the fuller context.
Yeah, totally. And I think that when Central Asian officials say objective, they actually mean sympathetic. I think they confuse journalism with propaganda, because this is what they've been doing, or journalists being at their service have been doing for forever. So having someone who is coming from a different world, has different values, and adheres to the standards of journalism is something really confusing. I won't be giving away all the details, but I had this kind of situation recently when I wrote an article about some Central Asian country, and through a contact of mine, and a Central Asian official was really surprised that why I wasn't praising this country, that there must be something wrong with me, with my journalism, with my loyalty, because I wasn't praising this country. I think that many officials, even those who spend some time in the West, they don't understand that journalism is about being critical of anyone in power, whether it's Central Asia or a Swedish government. And I think critique is also something that they really are afraid of, because I think that the majority of those people that I encountered, they're not even afraid of the government collapse or anything like that, because obviously in countries like Uzbekistan or Tajikistan, everything is so controlled that there is no question of government collapse or protests even, because in Uzbekistan, there are no protests. But what they are afraid of is that somebody higher up will not be happy with their work. Because, for example, you as an official, you were supposed to give an interview to this journalist, and she interpreted this as something that shows us in a negative light. So this particular official will have a problem. I think this really sometimes goes down to such petty feelings and organizational issues. Although obviously I remember that whenever I was reporting on something that wasn't particularly maybe understood or appreciated by the Uzbek authorities, I was called an agent of the West or a CIA agent or whatnot. And obviously foreign journalist is always seen as somebody who comes from a different world, who wants to impose something. And your reporting is not seen as basically a description of the reality, but rather that, through your reporting, you want to change something, or you want to affect the situation in the region and even destroy the local values, which obviously is not the case.
But I think, again, I would just warn against being too catastrophist. Look, we're obviously talking about a very wide spectrum of countries here. So, once I start saying this happens over there, of course, I have to remember that a totally different set of things happens in another country. But if I think of Kazakhstan, for example, if you see ministers giving press conferences in Kazakhstan, this poor guy, because he usually is a guy, the journalists just give them such a hard ride in the press conferences. They give them like a proper grilling. What I find really frustrating is that sometimes the aggression that you hear from journalists, even in Uzbekistan, to a lesser extent, but it's not unknown for journalists to be quite robust with officials in the rare occasions when they give press conferences, which admittedly is far less often than in Kazakhstan. It's just that that kind of critical tone or aggression doesn't actually come through in their reporting. So that's the sort of the disappointment for me is that these are, I gotta say, journalists in Central Asia are an exceedingly, I'm not brown-nosing here, I just often find them to be really bright, really on top of their subjects. They tend to know things in a kind of a level of detail which I find quite bewildering and extremely humbling. I can barely string two sentences together and hold a fact in my head, but I just find journalists just are so on top of their subject. And they're so, when you see them at work, they're just super aggressive and on top of it. But this somehow isn't reflected in the output, and that there's something broken in the system there. I know I'm speaking slightly at a tangent to the point which you just made, but when I think officials maybe are a little bit wary of us journalists, of foreign journalists, I think it's because they kind of know that their own journalists can be pretty rough with them. So, maybe they sort of instinctively know, well, our local journalists won't dare write anything rude about me. But this foreigner, God, what if they put it in some foreign newspaper? Then I'm really going to be in it. But, that's a much larger. So I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to put a benevolent spin on it, and maybe I'm being too generous.
I don't know. I think it also obviously depends on the person, and everyone is different. But I think everyone worries about their image, right? This is something that is probably across Central Asia, that officials worry about their image. They care about their image, especially abroad. And and that's why many of them sometimes can, make a few steps too much to defend it. But I wanted to move away from this topic. How working in Central Asia has affected you personally?
I remember I was at a training seminar with a reporter that I worked with at EurasiaNet, which was the previous outlet that I worked for. And I remember we were in a taxi together. We were going to the airport, and I was ranting and raving, as I'm doing a little bit in this interview, about something or other that was kind of getting on my nerves. And he said to me, and he practices a lot of meditation and thoughtfulness. And he did kind of say to me, Peter, sometimes you just have to be, don't be so angry about everything. And I was like, oh God, is that what I am? Like, I'm always angry. Like, and I must admit, on bad days, it's not easy. It's not easy because I just I always feel like Central Asia is always just so close, kind of one step away from doing something really important, an important breakthrough. And yet there seems to be like an invisible force field that stops it from making progress in a lot of areas. And then that saddens me, I have to say. And it does make me, on bad days, angry. But then, of course, I'm not in Central Asia at this second, but I'll be there very shortly. And then you arrive, and then suddenly, I don't know, actually being in the region can annoy you in some ways, but it also brings you kind of such serenity and a certain, I don't quite know how to put it really, but it's suddenly all of this anxiety withers away the further away especially from the city you get. Like it just it has a kind of quite a relaxing effect. So it's a cocktail of emotion, to say. It's always a roller coaster in Central Asia.
Yeah, like whenever I go to work in a different region like Ukraine or Lebanon, I'm always astonished at how easy it is to get things done. Even when my colleagues complain that you have to wait for this accreditation, whatever, like 2 weeks, it's like, dude, in order to get accreditation in Central Asia, you have to wait 2 months, and most likely you won't get it. So when I was still in Uzbekistan, and on those occasions when I was crossing into Afghanistan to report from the then Islamic Republic, I always felt kind of relieved because it was easy to get interviews with officials. Everyone was super friendly. Nobody complained if you wrote something critical. I even had situations when I wrote critical articles and the minister who gave me an interview would basically retweet my story saying that, yeah, this story makes a few good points. So I think that this is something that I will never get used to in Central Asia, that anything is difficult, that getting a permission, accreditation, sometimes it's just even beyond reach. And I am jealous of other journalists and people who work in easier regions, because it seems like their jobs are just so much easier than ours.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes I kind of have Stockholm syndrome a bit. I make excuses for certain things. Oh, but you understand the region is like this and it's like that. And you're right. My entire professional experience has been in the post-Soviet world, and whether it's Ukraine or Russia or Central Asia or the Caucasus, and you kind of, the experiences have kind of all rhyme with one another. So I have really no experience of working in the Middle East. So unfortunately, I have no super positive comparisons to make like that. I do remember though, once I was in Dushanbe, I went up to the foreign minister of Iran at that time. I can't remember his name, Motaki, I think it was. And I said to him, I worked for the Associated Press at the time. I said, would you mind if I interviewed you? And he said, no, you can't interview me. Like I'm nowhere near important enough. You should interview the president, who was Ahmadinejad at that time. My jaw dropped to the ground. I was like, do you really think that's going to be possible? And I said, yeah, of course. Like he'll talk to anyone. And I was like, oh my God. And he said, okay, listen, just wait here and I'll be back in 5 minutes and I'll just go and talk to him. So he went out and came back 5 minutes later, and he had a really kind of disappointed look on his face. And he said, listen, I'm afraid you're not going to be able to do like a one-on-one interview. There's going to be another like two people in the room, like two other journalists. Is that okay? Like, I'm really sorry. And I was like, and I was like, wow, this is, so yeah, you're right. I mean, this is my very, again, long-winded way of agreeing with you. So yeah, it's tough, but whatever. I guess that means that when you get those wins, that you should be double, triple proud of them.
So what brings you back time and again to the region where working is very often impossible?
You know, part of it is I'm hostage to my own specialization at this point. You know, I do love the region. There are days, as with anything that you love, where it drives you crazy, as I said before. But I always feel, and maybe I'm deluded, and I feel this now, that the country's kind of on the cusp of something or around the corner from something. And it always feels like it's in a moment. And I feel like it's sort of in a moment now. And I feel like one of the potential small, very faint silver linings of the just appalling tragedy that Ukraine is currently experiencing is perhaps, you know, this is a kind of historical moment for regions like Central Asia and I don't believe in like turning away from Russia. I mean, that's not going to happen. I mean, I think it's completely deluded to think that Central Asia will ever divest itself completely from Russia. But I think it's suddenly starting to sort of put its head up and look around and see that there's so many other options and directions it can take its future in. And I kind of see the green shoots of that happening. And I think, well, you know, damn it, I've been following this region for a couple of decades now, and I feel like something might be happening here, and I want to be there when it does.
And to this end, both you and me, we decided to invest in our own projects. Your newsletter is like 6 months old already, and you already have a big following and quite a few subscribers. My project is completely new. But to finish, what kind of journalism does Central Asia need? Or like what kind of journalism we should be doing to maybe draw more attention to the region, or maybe to make the region more relevant for Western audiences, politicians, you name it?
The very simple task that I set myself is that people who read my newsletter will have some sort of rough sense of basically what is happening on the day-to-day. Like, what is the general direction in which these countries are going? What are the kind of the facts? What are the numbers that people need to have in their head to have a sense of where this country is going? You know, I write longer pieces that try to look at trends. I'm always shy to make overly confident assertions about the direction in which kind of culture and society is going. I don't feel too qualified to speak about those things at great depth, but I feel I can kind of give a very broad strokes sense about those things. And I think that stuff I can do, and I think is important to sort of just normalize the region. Maybe this is sort of what we've been grappling with in this conversation, is the need to normalize Central Asia, talk about it and talk about the processes in this region in a way that don't make it seem like some kind of peculiar, exotic place on the periphery, but as a place which, although with very broken political systems and very authoritarian political systems, the fundamental kind of logic that underlies these political societies is not that different from ones that you would find in Europe or other parts of the world. You know, people want the same things, and that, many of the kind of the mechanisms are really quite familiar.
Thank you, Peter. I hope this is all going to happen for us. And I hope that both of us, our projects will become mainstream and super successful. So thank you so much. And yeah, I hope to speak to you soon.
Indeed. And then thank you so much. And actually, before you sign off, I mean, I would obviously think the other half of the answer I should have given there is to talk about your project. I mean, I'm very excited to see how you're going to develop it and the stories you're going to tease out. I think that there's this whole other side of the region which strongly anticipate help us discover. So that's something I'm looking very much forward to seeing, and I wish you the best of luck in making a success of it.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media. Take care and tune in 2 weeks.